As you can see, this is the book that I published this summer, and it's based on research in a number of countries on this issue of political dropouts. That is, the fear that we're seeing, not only in this country, but other places, that a majority of the generation that grew up with the internet, roughly young people under 30, more or less, are not only not voting, but not paying attention, just treating political life of their country as something that doesn't concern them. And that's what I'm addressing. Canada is one of those countries, and in order to understand it better, I'm looking at putting it in a sort of international context. What happens elsewhere? Where do we fit in? So the first part of my presentation will be sort of following up on Dr. Wesley in terms of, yes, we see the situation in Canada, how does it fit in with other countries? And the second part will be following up on Debbie Anderson in terms of what are some countries doing about this. Yeah. Whoops, went the wrong way. Oh, I got it upside down. There you go. There you go. Okay, so that's the subject of my presentation. Let's start off with some numbers. Now, I'm not interested in turnout in and of itself, because if all we cared about was getting people to vote, very easy to do that. Do what the Australians and Belgians do, find people who don't vote unless they have a good excuse. And you can get turnout right up into the 80%, if not 90%. But what we want is people, as I said, to pay attention. And then if they pay attention, normally they'll find something of interest enough to actually go to the trouble of voting. That's what we find. So if we look at different countries, this was done in the mid-2000s, so we're comparing those born since 1980, who would have been roughly under 25 at that time, from comparing it to everybody else. You can see that some countries, this is turnout, voting in elections, percentage. Some countries are higher, both for young people and for everybody. Typically, as we'll see, there's a difference between young people and the population as a whole. But also there's a real difference between high turnout countries, high participation countries, and low participation countries. Now this is just European data that a colleague of mine in Sweden that we put together. Canada would fit in here, as would the United States, namely around 40%. In other words, if we take the under 25s, what percentage turns out? We saw some of that data from Professor Wesley, and we know that. And we probably have something similar on Monday, maybe a little bit higher than 40% if we're lucky, but probably not much because it was only 37% last time, and the overall turnout went up about 3%. So if young people went up the same proportion as the as everybody else, it would be around 41%, which is what it is in the United Kingdom roughly, and in the United States. 60% tend not to vote in elections. That's a large percentage. Now, if we look at this whole generational question, and this is an illustration of what was mentioned by Dr. Wesley, that is that we have two phenomena at the same time. We have a life cycle, right? That you vote less when you're young and more when you get to be 40 and 50, and then of course when you get to be very old, you're not in shape to vote in many cases. So this is just a portrait of the different generations in Finland. And what's interesting about it is it shows you that, I won't go into the number of details, this is age, percentage of turnout, and of course it starts higher. It starts at 55, while in Canada, as I said, we're under 40. But you have an age, a generational difference, as well as a life cycle difference. So the Finns, when they will get up to middle age, they'll be roughly at, this latest generation will probably be roughly around 70%. Canada, if we're starting here, and if things continue the way they are, we might be around 50, 55%, which is still not enough. It means that close to half the population will not be voting. That's the kind of thing we need to worry about. But as I said, it's not just turnout in itself. If we just cared about turnout, we would have compulsory voting. What I'm concerned about is, past that, is political knowledge. Or political attentiveness, that young people or everybody else pays attention to what's going on in political life, and then finds an issue enough in the way of discussion of issues, of alternatives, to justify voting. My own research focuses on political knowledge, comparing the levels of political knowledge of different generations and in different countries. In the 2006-2007 period, in collaboration with a research group in the United States, we had a survey, we did surveys in Canada and the United States in which we included political knowledge questions. These were the political knowledge questions. Basically, sort of standard kind of things, a little bit easier than Debbie Anderson's questions, I must say. You know, like who has the right to vote? Was more money spent on pensions or on foreign aid? Which party is more conservative? Things of that sort. And the results, and I have the American results here, which were a bit worse than the Canadian. Or I guess here I compare both. This is Canada here, and this is by age. But basically, what you can see is there's not that much difference. The average person, especially among young people, could answer two to three questions right out of 7. And when we look at the United States, this is what it looks like for the United States. Almost 20% could answer no questions correctly. Almost 25% could only answer one question correctly. And as we start getting more questions correctly, the proportion goes down. And the most classic example of this in the United States is this one. Which party is more conservative? Now, if you know anything about American politics, there's only 2 parties, so if you guessed, your chances of getting it right would be 50%. And if you know anything about American politics, you'd be able to say Republican, because this is such a common part of American political discussion that you have to be completely, essentially living on another planet not to associate the 2 terms. And yet, only 40% of young Americans could do that. 60% were unable to make that association between the Republican Party and the term conservative. And that's roughly the same group that doesn't vote. And you can understand that if you cannot choose between, how can you choose between the Republicans and Democrat candidate if you cannot make such a basic distinction? And in Canada, it's a little bit better, if you saw those numbers, but fundamentally, it's not much better. And if we compare to Europe, this was a study by the National Geographic magazine, and it was based on geographic political literacy, and asked questions like, in which country are the Taliban? They were all multiple choice questions and so on. And there were 56 questions, and you can see the Europeans did pretty well. The Swedes got 40 out of 56 on average. The Americans got 23 out of 56, okay? Canada did slightly better than the Americans. We got 27. The 18 to 24s got 27 out of 56. So if we compare ourselves to the Americans, we look pretty good. But if we compare ourselves to everybody else, we look very bad. So again, it's that 40% rule. It's the basic problem that we have 40%, 60% of young people who aren't paying attention and who aren't voting. That's essentially the reality in our country, but it isn't the reality in those other countries. As you saw the numbers, once we go to Northern Europe, to Denmark, to Sweden, you're getting numbers in the 70s and maybe even 80s in terms of participation for young people. And that's not simply because there's no compulsory voting, but it's because they're paying more attention. If we look at, this is a bit out of date now, but this is from my previous book, and it looks at newspaper readership. And look at how young people in these countries, the ones where they vote, are reading on 70 to 80%, or 60 to 70%, 60 to 80% are reading newspapers every day. While you get down to Canada and the United States and Britain, it's closer to 40%. Again, not an accident. Those numbers are coming back regularly when we compare countries like Canada, the United States, and Britain to the countries of Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands, that I look at for examples of getting young people to participate. Okay, well that brings me to the second part of my presentation, which is how do they do this? How is it that some countries do better than we do, and what can we learn from them? Now, I haven't got much time to go into this. My book has a lot more detail about this, and since then I've been gathering materials. One of the reasons I was happy to come here to find out what you're doing in Manitoba and so on. But just some very quick examples. And the first point I want to make is, in order to have an effect, you have to target those who are potential political dropouts. So we can have all kinds of model parliaments where interested young people will go and they will get to be in model parliaments and have a good time, but that will have no effect because those young people are already interested and are already going to be voting and paying attention anyway. It's getting to the others. And the American studies have shown if you target civic education in terms of voting, of an effect on voting, has a great effect on those from poorer neighborhoods than those on rich neighborhoods. And it makes perfect sense. So what can you do to really get at those potential political dropouts when they're still at school? And of course, the focus has to be on civic education, the kind of thing that we're doing here today. I want to bring your attention to three things, one of which I won't have time to describe, but during the question and answer period we can talk about it. One is you've just participated in the student vote. Very important. It's much more systematically done in those countries, and it's integrated into a civic education program that is much more compulsory. Teachers are specially trained for it. The curriculum has been developed over a long time, and so that's one aspect. Another aspect is what some of you may know of, the Vote Compass. Any of you know Vote Compass? Right? No? Nobody? Wow. Well, you guys are young. Anyway, during this election through CBC, television and radio, you could do a simulation of, you could vote, you're asked to express your opinion on 30 issues, and based on your opinion, and this is done on the internet, online, they tell you which party you're closest to if you're ready to vote. And this is the first time in Canada, but they've been doing these things in Europe, in most countries of Europe for many years, and in some countries they integrate it into the civic education program, as you can sort of imagine. Germany especially, and also Switzerland, are examples of this. And again, this is something we could be doing. We have Vote Compass. It could be used in the civic education in a systematic way, and it could be developed. You know, it could be developed with questions, the whole way it's organized, because it isn't well organized at this point, but it could be. And the final aspect, which I haven't got time to go into, maybe during the discussion, is this simulation of a parliamentary committee in Norway. What's interesting about it is that it's very high-tech, very using all kinds of incredible interactive communications media, but it's targeted at every high school student, not just the ones who are interested, but every high school student through their civic education class at one point during their high school education comes with their class and participates. So even the potential political dropouts participate in this simulation. And the Norwegians, unlike the Swedes and the Danes, they had problems. Voter turnout was declining. So they really made an effort through these kinds of things, through civic education, to try to build it up. And it seems to be working, although it still has a ways to go. So there's an example that we could be learning from. Thank you.